Bryan from B.A.Cons. I'm here with author, intelligent man, genius, whatever you want to call him, Micah Hanks. Micah, go ahead and why don't you introduce yourself and let us a little bit about your background, if you would.
Most certainly. Well, I mean, gosh, where do you begin? I'm interested in everything, and I was just telling some folks over here at the KGRA booth, I'm interested in all the ologies because science is just something that fascinates me. This weekend's interesting because we're getting away from just discussing like our mutual interest. You and I have had a brilliant 30-minute conversation this afternoon about geology, and we're looking at some of the common human experiences that fall a little outside of what consensus opinion tells us about the orchestration and the mechanics of the universe. Now, don't get it wrong. When I say those things that fall outside science, that doesn't mean that science can't be applied to them. My whole contention is if we're talking about people's claims of paranormal experiences, ESP, if someone has a prophetic dream, if somebody has a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, if these experiences common throughout traditions around the world, shared since time immemorial, in common parts of our mythology and our history, if these are something that are shared by different people in all parts of the world and that are, I mean, so almost perfectly described in a similar fashion from experience to experience, shouldn't science be applied to those things?
I think so, yeah.
And I think that absolutely there's a necessity, a very strong necessity for good skepticism. We have to be able to be skeptical of, what is the nature of this experience? How can it be proven? Is it something that can be tested for falsification? Good science requires a good test for falsehood. There needs to be a good consensus at the end, and that's kind of part of the problem we have with a lot of so-called paranormal phenomena. People all have their various theories. I think this is time travelers from the future. This is ghosts. This is someone from another paranormal, dimension beyond our own. These are operators from outside the matrix of reality in which we exist. Everybody's got their different theory about what paranormal phenomena is. If we can really truly apply science to these subjects, we can come to a consensus, which is what science requires, along with that test for falsehood.
Exactly. It's like the peer review process for anything in science. You
Yes.
have to be able to duplicate and show and prove that this is exactly what it is.
Absolutely. Now, on the other end of that, we might say that there are certain subjects that I wish, if treated and taken scientifically, if there are really good researchers who are going to take the time and apply their knowledge and their expertise and their know-how, I hope that we can have an academic community that's willing also to be accepting of those discussions and those subjects. For example, we've got guys like Dr. Dennis Tucker. Dennis Tucker was a fellow of the National Society. I'm thinking of Jim B. Tucker. Dr. Jim B. Tucker does research with regard to past lives, mostly working with children. He's probably documented now in thousands cases where children describe what appear to be events that were not experienced in their own lifetime, their young lifetime. Even the late Carl Sagan in the Demon Haunted World. I love that book. Yeah, I love Carl Sagan too. He was just a true, brilliant thinker. But in the Demon Haunted World, where he anecdotally kind of mentions some of these cases of alleged past lives and things like this, they may warrant further scientific inquiry. Now, they're probably dubious, he said. That's the science in him. The good scientist is always going to proceed cautiously. So I want to be clear, I'm not coming out here saying, well, I believe in past lives, I believe in ESP. No, I'm saying certain experiences, although many can be probably labeled dubious, some do, I think, warrant further scientific research. So we need good science applied, but we need a scientific community equally willing to be accepting of those if good science can be brought to the table that helps us orchestrate and explain these phenomena.
I also believe in good evidence. So you can't just take somebody who, comes up with stories constantly about, I had this happen or I had this happen. I think that's a big part of it as well, is having a good, solid person that you can look at and say, okay, this person has no reason to say something other than or make sure they're not plagiarizing a book, that they've heard from. For instance, for me, I had a dream. I'm a big person about dreams. And I do believe that they are a form of premonition sometimes, or just a helping hand along the way from past relatives or ghosts, if you will. A lot of people talk about that way. But I've had a dream. This was probably about 5 years ago, before my grandma passed. I told her, I said, I had this dream about an older lady. She said she was my grandma, and I was in a library in Cincinnati. And how I knew that, I had no idea. I just knew. She said, you were in Cincinnati, and she goes, well, Bryan, you'd like this book. And she showed me a book that was about the Cincinnati Reds. I'm a Red Sox fan, so I don't know how this happened in my brain. And I talked to my grandma about it, like the next day. I said, so I had this dream about this older lady saying she was my grandma, She was wearing like a purple floral dress, and you had the smell. You could smell smells of flowers, kind of a smell like a flowery perfume, older lady's perfume. And talking about the Cincinnati Reds for some reason, she goes, "What kind of color dress?" I said, "A purple, like a sundress, so like something you'd wear in the South, And she goes, "That's your great grandma. That's my grandma."
Huh.
And she was a big reader, and she loved sports. She loved baseball, and she traveled to Cincinnati.
Really?
And I'm like, how does this happen? Like, because I never knew her. I never talked to her. I never even really knew a history of that side of the family. So, in a way, it was kind of, I don't know if I was in a bad spot in my life. I don't know. But I just remember waking up kind of feeling happy, kind of like, okay, I've met somebody now. Like I love history.
Yes.
History
yes,
I think we need to keep our history, but I think that mysticism mixing with my family history kind of gives me a better feeling on how things happen and how your body reacts to not just this world, but there's got to be something outside just your brain making up things.
Sure. Well, yeah. I've had similar things happen where I've had a dream that seemed to, if not portend, it absolutely at least related to things that would happen later in real life, and that there was a certain kind of continuity. I've also had that experience happen. By the way, really quickly, when I was younger, I had a similar dream where I was riding in a carriage with an older woman who introduced herself as my great-grandmother. And I described this dream to my mom, and she said, "That was Pearl. You didn't know her, but that was Pearl to a T." And she was convinced that I'd had this experience. So very strange that I've had actually almost the same thing happen.
Yeah.
But even in a waking experience, I've had things like this happen. One of the examples I gave in the lecture earlier today was my best friend inviting me to come and be the best man at his wedding, of course, and to give a speech. But I had a feeling he might ask me to perform a song at the wedding. And I was standing there looking in the mirror one day when this thought struck me. I thought, he's going to ask me to play a song at the wedding. I go into the next room, and he has sent me a text message, and he says, "By the way, if I can distract you for a minute, I want to ask you something. Rachel and I, we're getting married. We're going to have our first dance." And he, immediately after I'd been thinking about it, asks me. But this was such a singular synchronicity for me that I had to try and find some way to document this. So when he asked me, "Can I distract you for a minute?" I immediately started typing out the answer to the question he hadn't asked yet.
Nice.
And then I saved this in a document. Now, granted, somebody could say, "Oh, you went back and changed that." You have no proof that you actually had this in the same chronological sequence you presented in here. I can tell you it happened that way. The text message chain still exists. Chris would account for this and say, that's how it happened. Mm-hmm. It was one of the most bizarre premonitory experiences, if you want to call it that. And again, I don't consider myself to be a person with psychic powers or anything. I'm not a mutant. I'm not one of the X-Men. I'm not Professor Charles Xavier. All I can say is that some people do describe having these experiences. I personally have had these kind of experiences. I don't know what they are, what allows for them to happen, but I do know that plenty of people describe similar experiences, and that to me is something well worthy of study.
Right. I think the deja vu experience as well is for me. My wife has always said, "Well, that's where you're supposed to be."
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an old wives' tale. I don't know where that came from, but I've heard that a lot, where they say, if you have deja vu, that's where you're supposed to be in that part of life. I don't know if you think the same, but it is kind of interesting because when you do have the deja vus lately that I've had now in my life, it's been kind of a warm deja vu. I used to, as a teenager, you always had those like horrific, kind of like just after an accident, kind of like, oh, why am I here, kind of a thing. But I don't know. What's your thoughts on deja vu itself?
It's interesting. One of the gentlemen asked that question during the talk earlier, during the Q&A, and I said the same thing. I'd essentially said, let's look at a deja vu as being a sort of a similar kind of a thing. Well, let me just say this actually, before I compare it to similar psychic phenomena. I will say that psychologically, what we would recognize deja vu as being is what's called hindsight bias. It's the concept that basically, as the neurons are firing during the experience of observing while you're in the moment, sometimes things can fire so quickly that your brain misperceives that something you're hearing and experiencing in the here and now is something that is either yet to happen or has already happened, typically has already happened, and hence the deja vu is, well, I feel like I've experienced this or heard this before. You may not directly connect it with anything prior to that experience. So psychologists would say hindsight bias, that's the explanation. I don't know if there's anything more to it. I can definitely tell you that for me, if deja vu is anything similar to these other experiences where I know 5 minutes before my friend asks me to perform at a wedding, I'm thinking about what song I might do or what he's going to ask me to play. that's not just hindsight bias. To me, there's absolutely more going on there. And maybe deja vu is indicative of some similar kind of an experience. And I try to think about all this. I haven't got time to get into it right now, but time, time is fascinating to me. The way that we experience time on a perceptual level. Is this all something that's happening in the here and now as we perceive it as being the linearity of time? Or does past, present, and future all exist all at once? But we, in terms of our consciousness, we only perceive it as what's happening right now. If the past and the present and the future are something that exists, and we as three-dimensional spiritual beings are perceiving only this right here, right now, but what is yet to happen exists already, is it possible maybe that some function of memory or some function of the mind apart from that perceives things out of order? Maybe so.
And I know you write about these kind of things as well. Can you tell us about a couple of, how many books do you have out right now?
Got a lot of books, but one that probably is most directly related to this subject is called Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule, Altered States in the Search for Sentient Intelligence from Other Worlds. And that's a mouthful. But the new edition, the second edition, is out, which has got a lot of additional information, full sources, updated and expanded. I try to source as much good academic material as possible with my writing, because although we explore these subjects, which often are sometimes labeled woo-woo, I think that it's important we apply good science to these kind of things and really think critically about them, and don't just believe for the sake of belief, but don't rule out in the absence of final proof. Sometimes there are things that are mysteries, but time and time again throughout history, applying science and applying diligent academic research has led us to new conclusions and finally answers about a lot of mysteries. Many of the mysteries that exist today will be explored and, I believe, understood eventually also. So yeah, Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule, and of course there's the website micahhanks.com. You can find that, and then my podcast is The Grailian Report, which is available at gralienreport.com. Okay,
sounds great. Well, I'm Bryan from B.A.Cons. We got Micah Hanks here, genius, mysticism. I don't know what we're going to say. Great guy. Love talking with him. We could probably talk for hours on end if we really had the time. But
you guys have to come on my podcast.
Hey, we're down for it. We love it. All right. All right. So I'm Bryan from B.A.Cons. We'll talk to you later.